All right, so the first question that we looked at was when the New England colonies united under one government, what did they call themselves? So, what you need to remember here is that we are not talking about the country of England. We are talking about the colonial region of the New England colonies, right? When that region, all of those colonies in that region decided to come together, what did they call themselves, right? So, the United States is not a thing yet. The United Kingdom already exists in Europe. So it has to be the Dominion of New England. Let's try to think about it like that. The United States is not yet real. The United Kingdom is real, but somewhere else. So they were the Dominion of New England. Another way to remember is that this is the only one that we have here that says New England right in it, right? The New England colonies united to become the Dominion of New England. All right, a shift in the political power from the British monarchy to Parliament. That was a and that was a document that was passed. Right, they passed a document in order to shift that power from the monarchy, which was the king, right? The British king. They took some power away from him and gave it to Parliament. All right. This is one of those examples where people were Googling it and getting the wrong answer. So make sure that what you're using to get your answers is either our vocabulary or the study guide, right? So for this one, the correct answer was the English Bill of Rights. Right, so remember we were saying that when we talked about all of those philosophers, that the idea of having more than one person in charge was to make sure that nobody abused the people's rights. So if you can use that to remember that we shifted some of the power in order to keep the people's rights in the English Bill of Rights. Right, earning what from trade was one of England's reasons for founding and controlling the colonies. So remember that England didn't let the English king didn't let the colonists go to the colonies just because he was a nice guy and he wanted them to have a happier life. That's not why, right? He gained something from having control over the colonies. What did he gain by having that control? It's the correct answer here is money, right? Remember that he let people go there because when the colonists are trading all of this new material that is only in the Americas that they don't have in England, and then he's taxing all of that trade, the king is making money off of the colonists being in the new world. All right, a system of creating and maintaining wealth through trade. Okay, so for this one, business owning. Okay, people own businesses, but that's not a phrase that they used in the colonial times. Democracy, we all know what democracy is. That is when the people get a vote in their government. So our correct answer has to be mercantilism. How I remember this one is that if the system is creating and maintaining wealth through trade, right? The colonial job of somebody who was kind of like a colonial like business owner or cashier. The colonial job where somebody used to trade things that they made, right? They would sell things for something else. That trader is called a merchant, right? Mercantilism is like saying it's very close to merchant, just adding ism. So if a trader is a merchant, then this system where you make money through trade is mercantilism. All right, true or false? trade went directly between the American colonies and Great Britain. So when the colonists were trading all of these brand new furs and cash crops to Britain and England, was there just one straight route that the ships went right from the Americas to Britain and right from Britain back to the Americas? No, right? The answer is false, right? There was not a trade that went directly back and forth. Instead, there was that triangular trade, right? The triangular trade, it was in the shape of a triangle and it went from the Americas to Britain and to Africa, right? Because they were trading goods, but they were also trading slaves. So there's a law that Parliament passed that restricted trade in the colonies. This was that law that me and Miss McNally talked about, where if a colonist had 50 furs to sell, then England had this law that they said you can only sell a certain amount of them. You can maybe only sell 25, because England was scared that if the colonists made too much money, they would have too much power, right? And they don't want that. So the law that they passed to make sure that they restricted that trade and the colonists didn't get too much money were called the Navigation Acts. Something that can help you here is to remember that whenever we talk about laws back in colonial times, not all of the time, but very frequently, those laws are referred to as acts, right? A law and an act in a legal sense are almost synonyms, right? They mean almost the same thing. A system in which goods and slaves were traded among the Americas, Great Britain, and Africa. So I referenced this earlier when I said there was not a trade directly from America to Britain, to England, right? There wasn't somewhere from America to England where people just went back and forth. Instead, they went from the Americas to Britain, to, I keep doing that, to England, and to Africa, to 3 different continents. Okay, so when they are trading between 3 different continents and places, they called that the triangular trade. Okay, so you guys know a triangle has 3 sides. That's what that beginning tri means. It means 3. So if you are trading in the shape of a triangle to 3 countries, it is a triangular trade, right? So if you saw a picture of it, it would look like a triangle, for how they took their ships. There was a slave trade that brought millions of Africans to the Americas on a voyage called the what? Right? So there's an infamous slave trade where they would go pick up slaves from Africa and bring them to the colonies. What was that voyage on the ship, right, that those slaves had to take? What was it called? So for this one, it's called the Middle Passage, right? The Central Park, that's a place in New York City in present day. That's not right. Colonial trade, that was mainly just when the colonies traded with each other, right? But the Middle Passage, that was that really dark and kind of depressing, right? Voyage, that kind of very depressing voyage that was taken, where the slaves would have to go on the ship and make it all the way back to the colonies. A religious, keyword, movement that became widespread in the American colonies in the 1730s and 1740s. So we learned about 2 big movements in the 1700s. One of them was religious, right? So I know it can't be the American Revolution because that did not happen yet. Reformation, that's not a word we've ever spoken about in this class, right? So it needs to be the Great Awakening. This may or may not help you. What I try to tell myself to remember which is which between the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment, which was the other movement that we spoke about, is that the Great Awakening is the religious movement. So you can think that if people who believe that God is a greater power, that when this religious movement was spreading, people were awakening to a greater power, or the Great Awakening. Another movement in the 1700s that spread the idea that reason could improve society. So remember, I just said that there were two different movements in the 1700s. One was religious, right? The religious one was the Great Awakening, where people are waking up to the idea of a greater power. And the movement in the 1700s, there was another one. So another movement was the one where people started using reason to try to improve society. All that means is that the philosophers, who are just people who pretty much their whole job is to think, right? They started thinking, wait, well, what if we came up with governments that could improve society as a whole, right? What if we could better the world that we live in by changing our government, right? So the religious movement was the Great Awakening, where people are waking up to a greater power, where the movement that has to do with using reason and the philosophical ideas was the Enlightenment. I try to think of that one as these people who think about things, right? They're trying to think of ways to make society better, of them having like a eureka, like light bulb goes off moment, right? Like when you see in cartoons that a cartoon has a good idea and a light bulb turns on top of their head, right? That's how they have these good ideas. So that light bulb idea goes with the enlightenment. The something traded and allied with the Algonquin and Huron. Right, so the Algonquin and the Huron are two Native American tribes. Right, and during the French and Indian War, somebody traded and allied with them. Right, so for this one, the correct answer is the French. All right, this one can get kind of confusing because we mentioned that the French took over Canada, but it was the French who allied with these Native American tribes. Now remember that you can do this Kahoot on your own if you want to quiz yourself, right? I'm just here to kind of give you a little bit more explanation in case you forget. All right, so the turning point of the French and Indian War came when the British captured what city in 1759? So I want us to take a moment to think here. Our options are New York, Los Angeles, and Quebec. Right? New York is in New York City, which I do not think existed yet in the colonies. Los Angeles is all the way in California. California wasn't even one of the colonies, right? All of the colonies are on the East Coast. Now, California is all the way on the other side of the country. So, Los Angeles does not exist yet. But Quebec, right, which is a city in Canada, which was taken over by the French, did exist. So that's why when people in Canada speak French, because the French took them over as their own colony. Right? So when the English and the French were fighting each other during the French and Indian War, there was a really big turning point when the British managed to capture this city, right? This French-owned city in Canada called Quebec. Native Americans, led by Chief, rebelled against new British settlements in 1763. So remember, there was somebody who managed to get a bunch of tribes, different tribes of Native Americans, to unite together in order to rebel against the British and the European settlers who were trying to take over their land. And this chief ended up making an entire rebellion against them where they ended up fighting, right? This was Chief Pontiac. All right, so if you remember from your vocabulary, we learned about Pontiac and Pontiac's Rebellion, right? When they ended up fighting the Europeans. Right? He was a Chief Pontiac, and he was the one who had all of the Native American tribes. He managed to get them to band together in order to fight against the Europeans in what is called Pontiac's Rebellion. True or false? The Treaty of Paris gave Canada and all French lands east of the Mississippi River to Britain. So when they signed this treaty, remember, we said we would not make you write what the treaty is called because a lot of treaties get signed in Paris, right? But the Treaty of Paris, did it or did it not give Canada and all the French lands east of the Mississippi River to Britain? It did. Okay, that's the whole point of this treaty was that after they had the war, they gave up these lands to the British. Sorry, the scoreboard is nothing because that's only me. To avoid conflict, King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, which banned settlement west of the what? So remember in the very beginning of this section, we gave you like a what if you were there type of question where we were like, hey, you want more land, but it's illegal to move west now. Would you do it? Right? When it was illegal to move west, that's because King George III issued this proclamation, right? So that meant the Appalachian Mountains, which Miss McNally showed you a picture of during class, and we told some stories about how it's so close to us that if we go hiking, right, it only takes an hour or two to get to the Appalachian Mountains. And they span pretty much through all of the colonies and even further south. So they were a good natural barrier for the king to use to say, you see those mountains? That's where you stop settlement because it is much too dangerous to go there. And we know that it's going to make the Native Americans angry, right? So this banned colonists from settling past the Appalachian Mountains. They were nowhere near the Mississippi River or the Great Lakes yet. Those are much further west. Lastly, the English philosopher of the Enlightenment who thought that people had natural rights such as equality and liberty. So remember, we read about 5 philosophers. This guy, who might be one of the most famous, he believed that everyone was born with a blank slate, right? So he felt that people were born without any knowledge and everything that they knew, they learned from experience, right? It was John Locke. So because he thought we're all born exactly the same, we're all born with just a blank brain waiting to learn things, right? No matter who you are, where you come from. So if we're all born the same, then he thought every single person should have these same natural rights, rights that they're born with, such as equality and liberty. Those were 2 of the rights that he thought everybody is born with, no matter who you are, right? And that is John Locke. Okay. Your other options were Squanto, who, as we remember, was the Native American who taught the colonists in New England how to farm, taught them the native farming methods, and Thomas Hobbes, who also was a philosopher that we learned about. But Thomas Hobbes was the philosopher who said, listen, we need one strong king who is going to tell everyone exactly what to do, because if he doesn't, people are naturally bad, right? Thomas Hobbes was like, listen, people are naturally bad, and if you don't put them in their place, they will fight and kill each other, right? Where John Locke had a more optimistic approach where he was like, listen, everybody just, they learn as they move about life, right? They don't know fire is hot until they experience fire. They don't know that, water is wet until they experience water. So he was like, listen, if we're all born with the same blank slate, then we're all born with a certain amount of rights that we all have in common, called natural rights as well. All right, guys, that is the end of this review. Good luck. You can go through this video to any point to try to, check out anything that you might be missing. You can just look at the little video preview until you find the question you're looking for. Or you can play this Kahoot by yourself, right? I just put this here so that you could hear kind of a little bit of extra explanation in case you forgot anything. But if you just want to quiz yourself, you can just click on the Kahoots or on the 3.2 study guide to find the answers. All right, you guys are going to do an awesome job. And feel free to ask if you have any questions before the quiz starts.